Racist officer stops black man, then learns he's the head of internal affairs. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share where you're watching from in the comments section. Your support will help us bring more meaningful stories like this. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the Sacramento skyline, casting elongated shadows across the streets and painting the sky in hues of gold, amber, and soft lavender. It had been a long, grueling day for Eric Porter, and he was more than ready to leave it all behind. His office walls had felt particularly suffocating today, the endless calls and emails draining his patience. Now, as he sat behind the wheel of his dark blue sedan, the soft hum of the engine and the whisper of cool air from the vents offered a welcome reprieve. The faint jazz melody played on the radio, a familiar tune he barely registered but found soothing nonetheless. Eric navigated the streets with the practiced ease of someone who had come to know the city's rhythms, even if he hadn't lived here long. He approached an intersection just as the traffic light flickered from yellow to red, instinctively pressing the brake. The movement was smooth and measured. There was no doubt in his mind that he had stopped in time. Oosed as he eased into the pause, the unmistakable flare of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. A sharp siren blared for a brief moment before fading, leaving behind only the pulse of flashing lights reflecting off his windshield. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly before he let out a slow breath. He glanced at the mirror again, noting the police cruiser rolling to a stop behind him. He had no reason to be nervous, no reason to expect anything beyond a routine stop. Yet something about the situation gnawed at him, a feeling just below the surface, intangible but persistent. With practiced composure, he pulled his car over to the curb and rolled down his window as he watched the officer step out of the patrol car. Officer Bradley Larson moved with measured confidence, the kind that came from years of authority and expectation. He was in his mid-30s, his buzz-cut hair barely shifting in the light evening breeze. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming in the golden light as he adjusted his belt with a deliberate motion. Every step he took seemed weighted, his posture radiating control as he approached Eric's window. "License and registration," Larson said, his voice devoid of warmth, a flat command wrapped in the kind of authority that didn't invite questions. Eric nodded once, his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for the glove compartment. He retrieved his registration and then pulled his wallet from his jacket, sliding his license free before handing both to the officer. There was no tremor in his hands, no sign of hesitation, but he could feel Larson's eyes locked onto him, scrutinizing every move as if searching for something unseen. Larson barely glanced at the documents before looking back at Eric, his expression unreadable but edged with something unspoken. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Eric met his gaze evenly, his tone polite but firm. "I'm not entirely sure, officer." Larson let the silence linger for a second longer than necessary before responding. "You didn't come to a full stop at that light." Eric frowned slightly, his brow knitting together in a mixture of confusion and calculation. "I thought I slowed down in time," he said, his voice even, devoid of challenge. "But I understand." There was a brief flicker of hesitation in Larson's expression, a moment where something unspoken passed between them. He could have written the ticket then and there, handed back the license and registration, and moved on. But he didn't. Instead, he lingered, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Eric, as if some deeper instinct was urging him to keep looking. "You're not from around here, are you?" Larson finally asked, his tone shifting slightly, an edge creeping into it. Eric hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't asking about his address. His question hung in the air, weighted with something unspoken. The pause stretched between them, and Eric could sense the shift happening. Not a routine stop anymore, but something else. Something heavier. The calm in Eric's demeanor didn't waver, but he could feel the tension winding itself into the space between them. He had seen this before, felt it before. the scrutiny, the unspoken judgments. The way some people looked at him and saw something that wasn't there. Larison leaned in slightly, just enough to tip the balance. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Eric replied smoothly. His voice remained steady, unwavering, but the shift in the air was undeniable now. This wasn't about a stoplight anymore. Larson wasn't just looking at a driver, he was looking at something else, something he'd already decided was worth questioning. Eric could feel it, an instinct honed over years of knowing when someone was searching for a reason to escalate, but he didn't flinch. He held Larson's gaze, unshaken, controlled. He knew better than to let the moment slip from his grasp. Larson exhaled sharply through his nose, then took a step back. With an exaggerated slowness, he folded Eric's documents, tucking them into his chest pocket instead of handing them back. His expression shifted slightly, something smug creeping into his features, as though he had already made up his mind about the man sitting in front of him. "Step out of the car for me," Larson ordered, his voice just a shade too casual. Eric exhaled once, steady and measured, before reaching for the door handle. He knew this wasn't just a traffic stop anymore, and so did Larson. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened ever so briefly, his knuckles whitening for a fraction of a second before he consciously loosened his hold. His face, however, remained impassive, betraying no emotion as he turned his gaze toward the officer standing outside his car. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his voice even and controlled, devoid of unnecessary inflection. His words carried no hostility, just a measured curiosity that suggested a man accustomed to maintaining composure under pressure. Officer Larson's lips twitched at the corners, a brief flicker of amusement or irritation, perhaps both, but he schooled his expression before it could fully manifest. "I asked you to step out of the car," he repeated, tone firm but laced with an underlying edge. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The words, though mild on the surface, hung heavy in the air. A warning. A veiled threat. The kind of statement that left little room for negotiation. Eric exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and with a calculated slowness, he unlatched his seatbelt. He reached for the door handle with unhurried precision and pushed it open, stepping out in one smooth motion. Larson's sharp eyes flicked over him, assessing, measuring. Eric stood slightly taller than the officer, his build lean but solid, his posture relaxed yet deliberate. He wore a tailored suit, crisp and dark, the cut expensive but understated. His polished shoes reflected the dim glow of the streetlights, a subtle testament to meticulousness. Everything about him exuded control, poise that was neither submissive nor confrontational, merely steady. But none of that seemed to matter. Not here, not now. Larison jerked his chin toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Eric complied, his movements fluid, unbothered. He placed his hands at his sides, fingers slightly spread, the picture of calm obedience. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" he asked, his voice still measured but with the slightest undercurrent of something more, something that was not quite suspicious, not quite challenging, but something just shy of both. A faint smirk ghosted across Larson's face, fleeting and unreadable. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's gaze with an unwavering steadiness. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans?" His voice was mild, almost conversational, yet there was weight behind the words. "Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed like a well-placed blow, and for a fraction of a second Larson's expression wavered. He straightened, his shoulders squaring, his fingers twitching near his belt, more reflex than intent, but noticeable nonetheless. "Watch your tone," he said, the words clipped, his voice hardening. Eric didn't flinch. "I'm simply asking a question." There was no defiance in his tone, only quiet insistence, a firmness that was unsettling precisely because it was not accompanied by fear. Larson took a small step closer, his gaze narrowing. "You seem familiar with how this works. You got something to hide?" Eric let the silence stretch just long enough to make it noticeable before responding. "No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know." Larson scoffed, but there was no real amusement in it. He took a step back, pacing in a slow, deliberate circle. Something about this interaction wasn't unfolding the way he expected, and it was throwing him off balance. Most people stammered, fidgeted, and made nervous excuses. Most people looked for a way out of the tension. Eric did none of those things. He remained still, poised, unreadable. It was unsettling. "You seem pretty confident," Larson muttered almost to himself, "like you think you know what's going to happen next." Eric tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Larson froze for half a second before turning back to face him. The smirk was gone now, replaced by something sharper, something colder. He opened his mouth as if to retort, but hesitated. Eric's unwavering demeanor was putting him on edge, and he didn't like it. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Larson ordered, his voice clipped. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" His tone was incredulous but controlled. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Larson's jaw tightened, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not going to ask you again. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment one below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time." Eric hesitated for the briefest of moments, an unreadable flicker crossing his face. Then, without a word, he turned, placing his palms flat against the cool metal of his car's hood. Larson stepped forward, the crunch of his boots on the pavement filling the silence. His hands moved over Eric's torso and down his sides, the pat down rougher than necessary, his touch lingering in places that had nothing to do with procedure. It wasn't just a search. It was an assertion of power, a test, an attempt to provoke. But Eric didn't react. He didn't tense, didn't jerk away, didn't offer the smallest indication that he was rattled. He remained steady, unyielding in his stillness. "You're clean," Larson muttered, stepping back. The words sounded begrudging, as if he was annoyed at the lack of justification for his suspicions. Eric straightened and turned to face him, his expression unreadable but his gaze sharp. "Of course I am." His voice was quiet, but the certainty in it carried weight. "Now, officer, if you're done—" "I'm not done," Larson snapped, the words leaving his mouth too quickly, betraying his frustration. His authority was slipping through his fingers, and he could feel it. He squared his stance, trying to regain control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Eric folded his arms across his chest, his posture loose despite the tension in the air. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson's eyes narrowed. "That so? You a lawyer or something?" Eric's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. "Or something." The ambiguity irritated Larson, who stepped closer, invading Eric's space. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric held his gaze without flinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here." The words landed between them like a live wire. Larson's expression darkened. He started to respond, then stopped himself short. His mouth pressed into a tight line, but something had shifted. Something irreversible. "People, like you, always?" Larson stopped himself abruptly. The unfinished sentence lingered, heavy with implication. Eric's expression remained neutral, but his posture changed just slightly. An almost imperceptible shift, but one that made it clear he had heard exactly what was left unsaid. "People like me," he echoed, his voice quiet but charged. Larson's shoulders stiffened. He took a step back as if realizing too late that he had crossed a line he could not cross. His voice, when he spoke again, was lower but less certain. "You know what I mean," he muttered. But they both knew that wasn't true. Eric's voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was impossible to ignore. "I think I do," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a finely honed blade. The calmness he exuded was no longer passive, it was sharp, deliberate, a weapon in its own right. He had stepped out of the role of the compliant civilian and into something else entirely, something that made the air between them shift. And I think we both understand that this conversation stopped being about a simple traffic violation a long time ago. For a moment, Larson seemed caught off guard. His lips parted slightly as if he intended to fire back a retort, but no words came. The certainty, the authority he had wielded so effortlessly since the moment he had approached Eric's car, now wavered. He was a man suddenly unsure of his footing, sensing that the power dynamic he had taken for granted was slipping out of his grasp. His brow furrowed, irritation flickering across his face, but underneath it was something else. Hesitation. The silence stretched between them, heavy and expectant, until Eric finally broke it with quiet finality. "Officer, I think it's time you know exactly who I am." Larson's expression tightened, his patience visibly fraying, his jaw clenched as he crossed his arms, posture stiffening with barely restrained frustration. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. He did care. He cared more than he wanted to admit. Eric, ever controlled, reached into his pocket with slow, deliberate movements, watching Larson's reaction carefully. His voice remained steady, almost conversational, but there was an underlying tension that made every syllable resonate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said, his eyes never leaving Larson's face. The officer's hand twitched near his holster, a reflexive movement born from years of training, but Eric remained composed. "No need for theatrics. I just want you to see it." The words hung between them, weighted with an unspoken challenge. Larson's gaze tracked Eric's hand as he withdrew a slim leather wallet, the subtle gleam of metal catching the dim streetlight as he flipped it open. The badge inside was unmistakable, its authority unquestionable. "Eric Porter," he said, his tone carrying the same ease as if he were making small talk over coffee. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." The reaction was immediate. Larson went rigid, his eyes darting between the badge and Eric's face, searching for any indication that this was some kind of trick. But there was no deception here, no bluff. Just the stark reality of who he had been dealing with all along. A flicker of disbelief passed through Larson's features, quickly replaced by something closer to dread. "Internal Affairs?" he echoed, his voice a fraction softer, as though saying the words aloud made them more real. "Yes," Eric replied smoothly, cutting off whatever feeble protest Larson might have been about to make. "My job is to ensure that officers like you uphold the standards and integrity of the badge you wear, that the power you carry is wielded responsibly, that the authority granted to you is not abused." His words were measured but firm, each one landing with the weight of an indictment. Larson's face had paled, his once confident demeanor unraveling before Eric's eyes. The cocky, almost dismissive attitude he had maintained up until this moment was slipping away, replaced by the stark realization that he had miscalculated. Badly. He shifted uneasily, taking an instinctive half-step back, as if physical distance could somehow undo the situation he now found himself in. His hand fell away from his belt, the gesture small but telling, like a man suddenly aware of just how precarious his position had become. Eric didn't give him the luxury of retreating. He stepped forward, closing the gap Larson had unconsciously tried to create. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this entire encounter has been?" His voice was calm, but there was a razor's edge to it, an unyielding force behind every syllable. Larson didn't respond. He looked like a man who had just realized he was in quicksand, sinking deeper with every second and unsure of how to escape. Eric let the silence stretch just long enough before continuing. It's not the profiling, though that's bad enough. And it's not the unnecessary escalation, either. He tilted his head slightly, studying the officer with a look that was equal parts scrutiny and disappointment. It's the fact that you did all of this without ever once stopping to consider who you were speaking to. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you swore to uphold. And why? Larson swallowed, his throat working visibly. He opened his mouth, but the words caught before they could form. He had no answer, none that he could give anyway. Eric held his gaze, unrelenting. Because I didn't fit your idea of someone who deserved respect, he said, finishing the thought Larson couldn't. His voice wasn't angry, but it carried the gravity of an accusation that left no room for argument. And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform. The words struck their target. Larson's shoulders sagged, the weight of the moment pressing down on him with crushing force. He glanced at the badge in Eric's hand again, as if hoping it might disappear if he just refused to acknowledge it. But there was no escaping it. No talking his way out of this one. Eric finally stepped back, granting the officer a sliver of space, but the authority in his stance remained unwavering. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice cool and even. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson hesitated. He looked torn, caught between instinct and self-preservation. The choice before him was clear, but the damage had already been done, and the hesitation, however brief, cost him more than he realized. Eric's voice dropped slightly, carrying a weight that made the air between them feel suddenly heavier. "And then," he said, his tone steady, deliberate, "you're going to hear from me again, not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." The words landed like a hammer. Larson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. His face, already tinged with red, deepened in color as the full meaning of Eric's statement took root. For the first time that evening, the officer seemed unsure of himself. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his chest pocket, pulling out Eric's license and registration. The movement was slower now, less authoritative. He held them out, his fingers unsteady, and Eric took them in silence. With a measured motion, he slid them back into his wallet before stepping toward his car. His hand found the door handle, but he hesitated, turning back one last time to meet Larson's gaze. "Remember this, Officer Larson," Eric said, his voice unwavering. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone, it makes you accountable to everyone." For a moment neither man moved. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustling of trees lining the roadside. Then, with the quiet click of the car door unlocking, Eric slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The headlights cut through the fading light, illuminating Larson's still figure as he stood on the pavement, his confidence shaken, his future uncertain. But for Eric, this was far from over. This wasn't just about one officer with an overinflated sense of authority. This was about the system that allowed it to happen in the first place. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. The drive home was quiet, but his mind was anything but. The encounter played over in his head, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. He had dealt with officers like Larson before, officers who believed their uniform granted them unchecked power, officers who saw accountability as a threat rather than a duty. And he knew he would deal with them again. But this time, things would be different. This time he had the authority to do something about it. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, the golden glow of early sunlight filtering through the blinds of his office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. The room was neat and efficient, much like the man himself. On his desk sat a single open file, Officer Bradley Larson. Eric scanned the pages, his eyes narrowing. The record wasn't spotless, far from it. Minor complaints dotted the file, scattered like warning signs ignored by those who should have paid attention. Unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, vague complaints that had been smoothed over with a few words and a quiet admonishment. Nothing had ever risen to the level of serious disciplinary action. But that was the problem. The system had let Larson slide through the cracks, and he wasn't the only one. Eric exhaled, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled as he considered his next move. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about the culture that allowed someone like Larson to operate unchecked. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant Linda stepped in, a stack of reports in her arms. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she said, setting the files on his desk. "I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, flipping through the documents. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in his voice. "Of course," she said simply, before slipping out of the room. He turned his attention back to Larson's file. The officer's face stared up at him from the personnel photo, a man who had likely never been challenged in the way Eric had challenged him the night before, a man who had learned the wrong lessons about what it meant to wear a badge. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a glass-walled conference room, the city skyline visible behind the older man's broad shoulders. Daniels was a veteran, with salt and pepper hair and the weary expression of someone who had seen too much. He listened in silence as Eric recounted the traffic stop, his face unreadable. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric said, his voice steady, deliberate. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a larger problem." Daniels sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally, quietly. And that's the problem," Eric countered. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Daniels studied him for a long moment before leaning forward, hands clasped on the table. "What are you proposing?" "Department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels exhaled slowly. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." "Good," Eric replied. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Meetings, interviews, reports, all of it feeding into something bigger than just a single officer's missteps. Eric worked tirelessly, compiling data, speaking with officers, and engaging with the community. The Larson incident became more than just a disciplinary case. It became a catalyst for long overdue change. At the internal hearing, Larson sat stiffly across from Eric, his usual bravado replaced with uncertainty. He shifted in his seat as the panel scrutinized his record, as Eric detailed the complaints that had once been dismissed as minor infractions. The ruling came down, suspension. But Eric knew the real victory wasn't just in Larson's punishment. It was in preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at a podium before a packed community hall. Officers, city officials, and residents all gathered to hear what came next. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Eric said, his voice clear and resolute. "It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in. And that's the badge—" We're building here together." The applause was loud, but Eric didn't linger on it. He wasn't here for applause. He was here for a change. As he stepped down from the podium, his eyes scanned the crowd. Some skeptical, some hopeful, all listening. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it would happen, and for now, that was enough. And there you have it, an encounter that was never just about a traffic stop. It was about power, perception, and the silent battles that unfold in everyday moments. So, what have you learned from this story? Have you ever been in a situation where staying calm and composed made all the difference? Comment below with one key lesson you're taking away from this and how you'll apply it in your own life. If you liked this video, please leave your comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life. See you in the next one.